Chapter 7 is all about nonverbal communication. I mentioned in Chapter 6 that it's my very, very favorite. It might be my favorite, but this is probably more important when you think about just how much communication we engage in and how much is happening in our lives. Because the vast majority of the communication in our world and in our lives specifically is nonverbal communication. I think the textbook does a fantastic job really of talking about the power and importance of nonverbal communication. Is really a straightforward chapter, so the concepts don't need a whole lot of extra explanation, and I think it's going to be meaningful and help you understand things a little bit differently than you would to begin with. But I just want to point out a few really key ideas. Frequently, our verbal communication and our nonverbal communication are telling two different stories. When that happens, which one do you think it is that you choose to believe? Even if it's not a conscientious thought process, it is just instinct. Do you believe the words, or do you believe everything else that's being communicated nonverbally? Well, you already know the answer. It's the nonverbals. We can figure out so much more based on what's not said. That's why Chapter 7 is probably even more important than Chapter 6. But of special note is looking at all the different categories of nonverbal communication, because it might be a bigger concept with more elements than what you probably thought of before reading this chapter or being exposed to these extra ideas. Frequently, you think of nonverbals as facial expressions, our eye contact, tone of voice, also our body language and gestures. Those are the big categories. But beyond that, we actually can realize that things like appearances are actually expressing and communicating things to people. If we can observe it, it actually is something that has been communicated nonverbally. It's a bigger, broader concept than what we usually think of by default. So this grows and expands the idea of nonverbal communication. Other elements that we might not have thought about is time, our use of time. How does it make you feel, or how often do you read into situations regarding time? If you get a text message, how quickly do you respond to it? If you send somebody a text message, you've been in the middle of a conversation, you ask an important question, and there's a long delay, what does it mean? It means something, right? But what does it mean? Why is there a delay? What happened? Is it because it's a question they don't want to answer? Do they get interrupted? We don't know. How does it make you feel when people show up late all the time? They don't seem to respect your time. That's something I have really big problems with, especially in a work setting. Like, why is other people's time more important to them than my time? I try to respect other people's time, and when it's not reciprocated, it really is communicating what they feel about you and how much value they think is in your time as opposed to theirs. So it might be something more than what you thought of before. We have this idea of physical space also. This could be as much as our physical environment. I lump those two categories together. What do our spaces look like? You keep on seeing some of my space behind me, not a whole lot. I intentionally don't show you everything in my home because you might be jealous, you might judge. Either one is appropriate, but I don't want it to distract from the actual primary message that I'm trying to communicate. But what does our space say about us? If it's a decorating style that we have chosen, if it's artwork that we select and actually want to have on display, why? What is that communicating? What does it mean if our space is messy or dirty instead of clean? We know that this can be communicating things. We also have this idea of how much physical space people like to have around them. What's comfortable for you? And what does it mean if people are too close? Close talkers are really uncomfortable to me, and we have personal bubbles. Personal bubbles are different in various cultures. And what we expect about space is a type of nonverbal communication. But the very, very largest category that I keep coming back to when I read chapter 7 is the idea of touch. Because so many different things are being expressed when we think about the category of touch. Our book and our authors mention the word haptics, which is another way of thinking about this. But what is happening when we touch other people, and how different is it based on the relationship? There are lots of different things that we actually can read into or try to read into and make sense of regarding touch. Like, if people are touching, I stated something really, really vague. Questions that actually make a difference in trying to figure out what does that touch mean are, who are these two people? What parts of their bodies are touching? Where are they when they're touching? Is it in public? Is it in private? Is it something that they're okay demonstrating? Is it something that's kind of hidden? How long does the touch last? How much pressure is applied with the touch? It sounds so simple. You think, oh, touch, oh, they high five or they handshake. Two different kinds of touch mean completely different things, whether it's formal or informal. Well, we can go way, way deeper. So I would really encourage you to take a close look at the whole section on haptics, and then try to put it into your own life. Just be observant and recognize how much you can learn by paying attention to people's nonverbals, and specifically the idea of haptics or touch. It can be really, really revealing. One last note, a big overall takeaway from chapter 7. When we looked at the idea of language in chapter 3, we learned about the 3 different types of definitions: the semantic, the syntactic, and the pragmatic. If you think that there's lots of variability with words and it's like, oh, there's so much opportunity for things to go wrong, recognize that there's even more potential of misunderstanding and less concrete definition and truth that can be observed just through nonverbals. There are so many more possible explanations for what is being communicated through those nonverbals. So while we can learn lots, we can screw up a lot too. But it really, really is a good section of life and communication to pay attention to. And just like with everything else, the more we get to know people, the deeper our relationship, and the more we know about the people we're communicating with, the more their nonverbals are going to make sense to us. We get used to deciphering and making sense of these nonverbal communication cues because we know the person. It's through that sharing of ideas, getting to know each other, back to the social penetration model, all the way back to the beginning of the chapter. When we get to know people and their identities, we understand what it is that they're communicating, both verbally and non-verbally. So I hope it was an insightful chapter. Probably didn't expand your idea of what communication is a whole lot, with potentially that exception on the types of nonverbal communication and just recognizing what a big category it is.